If there's one thing I know about quilters, it's this. We're full of opinions, and we like to spend our time debating and arguing about certain things. But there's also something else that I've noticed. You see, our opinions are based heavily upon what other quilters or people that we like or people that we follow, what their opinions on certain things are, and not necessarily based upon facts. So in this series, I'm going to take a deep dive into some of these debates and debunk fact from personal opinion. Because what works for one doesn't necessarily work for all. So I'm going to explore some of these rumors or myths that we have. And from time to time, I'm going to take a look at some of these quilting or sewing related products. My intention with this is not to persuade you or discourage you in any which way, but rather give you better information about a myth, a rumor, or a product so that you can make a better decision if it's right for you. Now remember, I'm a quilter and creator myself, so I do have my own personal opinions and biases, but in these videos, I'm going to be sure to point out some of those biases and opinions and make sure that you're aware that I'm expressing my own opinion. So take these videos with a humongous grain of salt because, well, we're going to be living on the bias. And so for our first video in this series, I'm going to debunk a mystery or a rumor that maybe some of you have heard. Frixion pens. Do the markings really reappear? Let's find out. Now, if you've never heard of or seen the Frixion pen in action, well, let me give you a quick demonstration. So the basis of the Frixion pen is that I could be marking up any kind of fabric, and just by hitting it with the iron, well, it gives the illusion that the ink disappears. Here I'm just kind of randomly coloring or marking up the fabric. And I even got a different style of Frixion pen here. Now, let's take this to the iron and let's see what happens to it. So I got my iron ready. Let's see what happens to the ink. And like magic, it just disappears. So as you just saw, with the Frixion pen, when you hit it with the iron or give it a little heat, the markings disappear. Or do they? You see, there's been some rumors about the Frixion pen in that when fabric comes in contact with very, very cold temperatures, there's a possibility that the markings can reappear. And so I wanted to put that rumor to the test. Does it really come back? That is the ultimate question that we're going to be answering with this video. So here's what I am going to do in this video. Now I have both of these fabrics have markings on them, or had markings on them. I'm just going to stick it into my freezer for now, uncovered, and just leave it in there for a couple of hours. Let's see what it does. I figure, well, the freezer is the coldest spot in my apartment right now. Now with this black and this orange marking, I'm actually going to hit it with the iron again. And as expected, the marking should disappear. We're going to stick it in the freezer, but before we do that, we're going to actually put this in a plastic bag. And I'm going to see if the plastic bag does anything to protect it, or does it prevent it from actually coming back. So let's get started with these experiments. So I wanted to actually dig a little bit deeper into these Frixion pens to kind of find out what I could find about who makes these, about the company itself, and what the original intent of these pens are. I found out that these Frixion pens, well, they're made by a company called Pilot. The original intent of these pens were for actually people who like to do journaling or like to write with a pen. You see, the problem is that when you do write with pens on a journal, traditionally there was no way to erase the pen, but with this Frixion pen, voila, you can actually erase your markings. Look at that. And start again. I was kind of wondering then, how does exactly this pen really work? And how is it erasable even on paper? Well, it does say erasable. Erasable, yep. Says it right there on the pen. So when you are writing with the Frixion pen, it's not that the ink disappears. Whoop, I totally made a mistake on that. You see, the ink is heat reactive, meaning that the pigment within the pen reacts to heat. Now, on the opposite end of this pen, normally if this were a regular pencil, this would be your eraser. Well, it's kind of like a rubber piece. It's not anything special, I don't think, but it's just a rubber piece that they stick on there, and you can rub your markings off. Now, that action of rubbing with this rubber piece, that action of just moving it back and forth like that, that creates friction, and friction creates heat. Almost like if you were in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, they teach you to rub two wooden sticks together to create fire. The action of rubbing those two sticks creates heat. So much in the same way, if you do make a mistake, the action of rubbing that little rubber piece creates enough heat so that the ink or the pigment within the pen sort of magically, well, it appears to disappear, but in reality, it just goes transparent. So I'll bet you, if I were to take the iron and put it on this piece of paper here, the markings are going to disappear. Let's try that. Yeah, it's on. And just like that. Wow, that was fast. So again, the way that this Frixion pen works is just that the pigment in the pen, it's heat reactive. So when you apply heat directly onto it, the pigment just sort of goes transparent. It does not disappear, and that's the trick to all of this. Now, I actually found some very interesting facts when I Googled Frixion pen. Found out that Pilot actually has a whole webpage dedicated to these particular pens, and they have a FAQ, or the frequently asked questions section, on their website about these pens. And it's interesting what they actually acknowledge. You see, other people have been actually complaining about these pens or the markings magically disappearing. Now, those other peoples, well, they're not quilters, they're actually journal writers or people who like to write in their diaries. They were saying that whenever they put their diary or journal, left it in some place where it's very hot, their writing just disappeared. So what did Pilot say to do to make it reappear? Well, what do you know? They said to just put it in a cold temperature place and magically the ink will react again and reappear. So basically, Pilot kind of knew that this ink is heat reactive, meaning that if you put something very hot or stick this in, or put your journal, put the fabric, whatever, put it in a hot place, they knew that the ink would disappear, but they also knew that the ink can reappear. Well, thanks a lot, Pilot. You could have actually saved us a lot of time debating over this if you just mentioned it directly on your product. Well, maybe they do, we just didn't read the fine print. So ultimately, does the pen or do the markings of this pen reappear? Yes, they do, but on certain conditions. I love to quilt. I wish I could make my belly fat disappear. Wait a minute, is disappear one S or two S's? Oh well, made a mistake. Let's go. We wiped away the evidence. Let's try this as an experiment. Now, this is a Frixion pen, but, well, it's not exactly a pen. It's actually a Frixion highlighter. It's an orange. So I'm just gonna take the rubber part and, oh yeah, it kind of does work. Huh, look at that. Okay, then if the ink is heat reactive, do I even need that rubber piece? All I just need to do is just kind of create friction, right? So I'm gonna just take my finger and I kind of put a paper towel wrapped around it. I'm just gonna rub it. Oh my gosh. Whoa. So you don't even need the rubber piece at the end here. You just need something to create friction or heat with it. And by golly. Wow, that even worked. Okay, let's try it with the pen. Would it work with the pen? I don't see why not. Okay, a little too much moisturizer. I need a little bit more friction, so let me get the, oh, you know what? Let me try this. Let me try it with this piece of fabric here. Yep. What do you know? It is disappearing. Huh. So it works on paper too. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna take this piece of paper and I'm gonna stick it in the fridge just to see what happens, because we should have a lot of markings on here, and if it comes back, then we have an ultimate answer. It's been a couple hours. Let's see the results from the freezer. Ooh. Yeah, it definitely did come back. Interesting though, that the freezer bag kind of protected it. Let's take these back to the sewing table and let's talk about this. So I guess I really shouldn't be all that surprised by it. The ink, in fact, did come back. And it didn't matter whether it was in the plastic bag or if it was just out there, out in the open in the freezer. So the plastic bag made no difference, really. The ink still reappeared. Now, what was a little surprising was the paper. That also came back. So I guess if you're a journalist, or if you are someone who likes to write in a diary, and you're using these Frixion pens, and it suddenly disappears on you because maybe you left it in your car, you left it in somewhere where it really gets hot, well, I guess the thing to do is just put it in the freezer and see if the ink comes back in a few hours or so. That kind of settles the question, but if it does reappear, what do you do? What to do, what to do, what to do? Well, let's see if it'll disappear again if I hit it with the iron. Yep. Like it was never there in the first place. Wow. Clean piece of paper. Or at least it appears to be. So I guess we got our answer. I mean, cold temperatures can make the ink reappear. So I wonder what other conditions actually influence the fact of the ink reappearing. Let's do a different kind of an experiment. And on this one, we're gonna have a little bit of fun. These are 2.5-inch squares here, and I'm gonna mark it up just like we did before. I'll put the red on here. We're gonna have a little fun with this because, well, there's one other place that I know of locally that is pretty darn cold. Let's head over there now. So, on a nice, hot, sunny Southern California day, there is one spot where I will go to kind of cool down. And, well, I actually have to go there anyway, so 2 birds, 1 stone. Let's go. So now, those of you who have heard the story, you know that I have a somewhat of a special parking spot at this location. So I'm heading there right now, and we're gonna check to see if my special parking spot is open or is it full or taken. So why am I trying this experiment at a different location? Well, if I remember correctly, back from my high school science class days, it's one thing to do an experiment and come out with a certain result, but if you change certain factors, will you still get the same results? You see, a smaller freezer will have a much more defined space, making the air a lot more concentrated, so the temperatures are going to be a lot lower. Plus, the more stuff you have in a freezer, the higher the temperature will go. So it raises the question, will I get the same results in a much larger and a much more full freezer? I had to think, what store has a large size freezer? I could only think of one spot. Besides, like I said, I needed to pick up a few things from there anyway. Plus, I was craving their $1.50 hot dog and pepperoni pizza slice. Yep, I am talking about Costco. There was only one problem. I forgot it was a holiday, so Costco was closed. And my special parking space, well, it was full. Oh shucks. The next day I returned to Costco, and this time it was open for sure. Got my fabric. Let's head on in and do this experiment. I did not want to stand out doing this, but if you met me in person, you know that would be a challenge. I'm a 6'6" Japanese. I bet you don't get to see that every day. But the camera I was using was a bit tiny, so maybe not so noticeable that I was up to something. Once in, I looked for the freezer section and put my first square in. Of course, I had to find a way to remember where I left the square, so I purposely left one of them in the ice cream section. Ooh, Haagen-Dazs. My forbidden fruit. Then I moved on to a different freezer and left another square. Edamame. Good with an adult beverage. Now it was on to the walk-in fridge. Okay, this is what happens when you put someone from Hawaii in a cold place. They freak out when they can see their breath all frozen. And then they complain how cold it is. It's definitely cold in here, but good thing I gargled with mouthwash before heading over. Anyhow, time to collect the fabric samples. I didn't want to leave the samples for too long, otherwise someone would have noticed them. So about 20 minutes went by and I started to collect my samples back. I was quite shocked at the results. Most of the fabric squares came back with no markings or barely visible markings. I'll take these back to the lab, also known as my sewing space, and talk about the results. But first, to pick up a few items, and I must have my hot dog and pizza. Don't judge me on that, because I know many of you get the same thing every time you go to Costco. Well, this was a truly fun experiment to do, and it wasn't so scientific, but you get the idea. So let's do a quick recap of the results. When I put the fabric squares into my own personal freezer here at my apartment, the markings did in fact reappear. But interestingly enough, when I took them to a much larger freezer with a lot more stuff, took them to Costco, the fabrics or the markings were barely visible or just didn't really come back. So, what can we conclude from this? Ultimately, the question that I asked at the beginning of the video is, does the fabric markings or do the Frixion pen markings have the potential to come back? And based upon the experiment that I did with just putting them in my own personal freezer, yes, they can. However, when I took them to Costco, they didn't exactly come back. So there are certain parameters that have to happen in order for the fabric markings to come back. Number one, it has to be below a certain temperature. And number two, I kind of feel like it has to hit the surface directly. So if you have a quilt that you are shipping off to someone in a colder climate, I'm imagining that you're going to be putting it in a box, you're going to be wrapping it up. Chances are that those markings, if you do use a Frixion pen, they're not going to reappear. And even if they do, all they have to do is just hit it with the iron again, and the markings are gone. Even if the markings do come back, not really a big deal, at least in my opinion. Speaking of which, in my opinion, who really will benefit from using a Frixion pen? Well, here are my thoughts. Now pay attention to what I just said, because these are my thoughts, meaning my opinion. If you are a person that is using a Frixion pen and you're just writing in your journal or you write in your diary, I think you'll be okay using the Frixion pen so long as you don't leave whatever journal, diary, as long as you don't leave it in a hot temperatured place, you'll be fine. But if you're the type of person that writes on a journal, you put your journal in a backpack and you leave your backpack in a car on a hot summer day, chances are that marking or whatever you wrote in that journal or diary, it might have a good chance of disappearing. So I wouldn't necessarily do that. But if you're keeping your diary at home in a safe, cooler place, chances are you're going to be okay. And if the markings do in fact disappear, just stick it in your freezer for a couple of hours. Now, specifically for those of us quilters out there, is it safe to use these Frixion pens? My opinion, it's pretty safe. Chances are you're not going to have the quilt get cold enough to make the markings reappear. Unless you are planning on using the quilt and going camping out in the middle of winter, or if you are using the quilt as a picnic blanket in the middle of winter, yeah, chances are these markings are not going to come back on your quilt. However, if you're doing a special type of quilt, maybe you are going to enter this quilt into a show, maybe you're shipping this off to someone very, very special. Would I use a Frixion pen for those type of quilts? You know, I'm the type of person where I'm going to be very conservative and, well, you know the old saying, better safe than sorry. So if it's a quilt where it's going to get judged, if it's a quilt that is going into a special competition, if it's a quilt that you are really worried about the markings coming back because it is going to a special person, then better safe than sorry. Don't use the Frixion pen. You might be better off using something like Tailor's chalk or some other marking pen device. Personally, I do like using Frixion pens, but I don't use it to draw out quilting motifs or mark sewing lines. How I use it is actually just to mark where my cut line is going to be. Like if I'm making 2 at a time half square triangles and I need that diagonal line, well, I'll pick up a Frixion pen and just draw that line. So I'm not really going to be worried so much about the markings reappearing. But now it's your turn. How many of you out there use Frixion pens? And especially for you quilters, have you experienced a situation where the Frixion pen or the markings actually came back? Put a comment down below and let all of us know, because your results might be different from mine. Or how about this? Especially for you quilters out there, what's your favorite marking tool? Put a comment down below. I'd be curious to know. Well, I hope you enjoyed my investigation on the Frixion pen. Put a comment down below, and if you like the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications and when I upload the next video. Now, I do have some topics and some products that I would definitely like to include in this series. But if you have something that you want me to comment about, put that also in the comments down below. So those are my thoughts about the Frixion pen. Now, what are yours? I will see you on the next video where we will live again on the bias. Now let's all get out there and let's create something.